It was my first night alone at the mini market, right at the edge of town where the city lights don't reach and the darkness feels a bit thicker. The place was quiet, too quiet, with just the hum of the old refrigerators breaking the silence. There was an eerie vibe hanging in the air, and it didn't help that there was a beat-up van parked right at the edge of the lot, like a dark shadow lurking just out of sight. I was halfway through stacking some cans when the door flew open so hard it nearly came off its hinges. In rushed a woman, her face ghost white, dragging two kids behind her. Her eyes darted around wildly as she pulled me aside and hissed, "Lock the door. Someone's been following us for miles. Please, you have to call the police." Without a second thought, I slammed the bolt shut and grabbed the phone, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. Meanwhile, I could see the headlights of the van turn on, cutting through the store's foggy windows as it started to circle the building like a shark sending blood. The kids were huddled behind a rack of chips, their eyes wide with terror, and their mother kept peering out the window, jumping at every shadow. Before I knew it, I spotted 4 figures stepping out of the van, their faces hidden behind masks. They began to pace around the outside, testing the doors and banging on the windows. One of them caught sight of me and started pounding on the glass, shouting threats. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead. I shouted back, "The cops are on their way. Just leave us alone." That's when they started throwing rocks and whatever else they could find at the windows. The glass held, but it began to spiderweb, the cracks spreading like lightning. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. In a rush of adrenaline, I remembered the emergency exit in the back storage room, a narrow, rusty door that we'd barely ever use. I motioned to the family, and we sneaked through the aisles, trying to be as quiet as possible. The back room was cramped and cluttered, filled with boxes of unsold stock and old promotional signs. We squeezed through, barely making a sound, and I fumbled with the locks on the emergency exit. It groaned open, protesting with a screech that I prayed wasn't heard. We slipped out into the chilly night air, the woods dark and unwelcoming ahead of us. We ran, the ground uneven under our feet, branches snapping under our steps. I could hear the shouts of our pursuers not far behind, their flashlights sweeping through the trees like searchlights. We ducked down into a ditch, the cold earth pressing against us. The kids were shivering, trying their best to stifle their cries, their mother's arms wrapped tightly around them. Every minute felt like an hour as we heard them splitting up, the beams of their flashlights darting back and forth above us. Just when I thought they'd find us, the distant wail of police sirens filled the air. The pursuers cursed, and the sound of them scrambling back to their van was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. We stayed low until I saw the red and blue lights flashing through the trees and heard the officers calling out to us. They escorted us back to the market, the family clinging to each other, relieved but still shaken. The police checked the area and took our statements. They thanked me for my quick thinking, saying it could have gone a lot worse if we hadn't managed to escape. As dawn began to break, the market stood silent, a mess of broken glass and scattered products. It was over, but the shadow of the night lingered. I went home as the sun rose, the events of the night replaying in my mind over and over. I knew one thing for sure, I'd be back at the market tonight. But this time, I'd be ready. There's something about facing your fears head-on that changes you. I wasn't just going to be some guy working the night shift, I was going to be the guy who kept the night at bay. I never thought working the night shift at a gas station would be anything but boring. Boy, was I wrong. I'm Jake, and I've been manning this little station off Route 55 for a couple of months now. Most nights are quiet, just me, the humming of the fridges, and the occasional trucker looking for a late-night coffee fix. But not tonight. Tonight, the fog was so thick you could slice it with a knife. It rolled in like a silent wave, swallowing everything beyond the reach of the gas station's lights. It was around midnight when he showed up. The screech of his car pulling in was like nails on a chalkboard in the dead quiet of the night. The car looked like it had been through a war, scratches, dents, mud plastered all over. He stumbled out, a scruffy man with wild eyes and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in days. He shuffled in, his eyes darting around like he was being followed. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, desperate. 20 on pump 5, he muttered, barely making eye contact. I nodded, trying not to stare at the mud and what looked suspiciously like blood staining his jacket. After he pumped his gas, he left something behind on the counter. It wasn't until he drove off that I noticed it, a large, rusty knife with a dark stain dried onto the blade. My stomach turned. What was I supposed to do with this? Call the cops over a dirty knife? I decided to lock it up in the lost and found drawer, telling myself I'd deal with it in the morning. That's when the power flickered. The lights dipped, and for a moment, the world went silent, then they surged back to life, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Glancing at the security monitor, I saw his car still parked way out in the lot. Was he sleeping out there? Something wasn't right. The station's door suddenly rattled. I jumped a foot in the air. It was him again, back at the glass door, pounding with both fists. I need my knife, he gasped, eyes wide with terror. Please, you gotta let me back in. Now, I'm not a hero, and I'm definitely not a fool. No way was I opening that door. Look, man, I can't help you, I called through the glass. He became frantic, glancing over his shoulder. That's when I saw another car creeping through the fog, its headlights off, moving like a predator stalking its prey. He saw it too and started to panic, his voice breaking into a high-pitched scream. They're here for me. Please, don't let them get me. Two figures stepped out of the car, big and menacing even in the dim light. They started walking towards the gas station, their movements deliberate, unhurried. The man at the door was shaking now, his eyes pleading. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and yanked him inside just as the figures reached the front. We scrambled to lock the door again. The two outside didn't shout or bang on the door. They just started circling the building, checking each window, testing each potential entry. The man was beside himself, whispering over and over, "They want to kill me, they want to kill me." One of the figures pulled out a crowbar and started working on prying the door open. I could hear the metal groaning as he applied pressure. My heart was pounding. I didn't sign up for this. The man was a blubbering mess by now, hiding behind the counter. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver about the men trying to break in, about the witness I had inside. The dispatcher promised help was on the way, but those minutes stretched out like hours. Just as the door started to give, sirens cut through the fog. Never in my life was I so happy to hear that sound. The figures stopped their prying, looked at each other, and without a word, sprinted back to their car. They were gone before the police even pulled in. Turns out, the man I saved was a witness in a major crime investigation. Those guys were sent to silence him. The cops took him into protective custody, and I gave my statement, my hands still shaking. As the sun rose, cutting through the fog, I sat down on the curb outside the station, the morning feeling like the calm after a storm. I knew one thing for sure, I was done with the night shift. No job is worth that kind of terror. So, that's my story. A night that started like any other and ended with me saving a life, whether I wanted to or not. If you ever find yourself out late at night, near a deserted gas station, remember, sometimes the most ordinary places hide the darkest secrets. It was the darkest, foggiest night I'd ever seen, the kind that swallowed the streetlights whole, leaving them mere ghosts in the mist. Will and I were alone in the mini-market, surrounded by the quiet hum of refrigerators and the occasional flicker of overhead lights. Will cracked jokes about ghosts in the woods just beyond the parking lot, trying to scare me, I think. But it was all fun and games until he showed up. The door creaked open slowly, and there he was, just a silhouette at first against the dense fog. As he stepped in, the lights seemed to flicker more aggressively, like they were trying to warn us. His hair was long and unkempt, his clothes ragged and dirty as if he'd been living in those woods Will joked about. His eyes, though, they were the worst part, too intense, too knowing. He wandered the aisles, not like a normal customer browsing products, but like he was searching for something he'd lost years ago. Occasionally, he'd stop and touch the mirrors, speaking under his breath about eyes watching him, always watching. It was creepy, sure, but when he came to the counter, things took a turn for the sinister. "Do you ever wonder what fear tastes like?" he asked in a gravelly voice that made my skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, make it seem like just another weird night shift story to tell later. But his next question froze me. "Have you ever wanted to disappear without a trace?" Will and I exchanged nervous glances. The man left, but he was back again and again, each visit more unnerving than the last. On his third return, he left something on a shelf, a small doll, crudely made, with its eyes exit out. That shook me. It felt like a message, but for what? The final time he came in, his demeanor had shifted drastically. He slammed his hands on the counter, his face inches from mine, demanding we give him the key. I had no idea what he was talking about, and I told him so, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept shouting about the key that would let him out, let them all out. Then, the lights went out. Not just flickered, the darkness was absolute, as if the night had seeped inside the store itself. The sound of glass shattering rang out, and I heard him, his voice twisted in anger, moving around us in the shadows. Using our phones as makeshift torches, we caught glimpses of him darting through the aisles, his whispers chilling the air. "You can't hide in the light forever. I'll find you." Will was trying to call the cops, his fingers trembling over his phone. In the pitch black, lit only by the strobe of our phones, I made a decision. I reached for the silent alarm under the counter, a desperate move. Red lights began to flash with the alarm, bathing the store in a pulsating glow. It disoriented him, that much was clear, as he howled in frustration and confusion. The police arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the stillness of the night. The man took off as soon as he heard them, bolting out the door into the misty darkness from which he'd come. The cops chased after him, but I knew they wouldn't find him. He was a shadow, part of the night. After they left, taking our statements and shaking their heads in bewilderment, Will and I surveyed the store. The chaos was evident, products thrown about, mirrors cracked, and that doll, still sitting there on the counter, staring at us with its exit-out eyes. I haven't been the same since that night. The fear lingers, a constant companion. I find myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at small noises, watching the shadows. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the woods are just a dark outline against the night sky, I think about him. Is he out there, watching, waiting, still looking for his key? And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear him whispering through the trees, reminding me that he's still there, still searching, still hungry for something only the dark can give. That night taught me the true taste of fear, and it's something I can never forget. Every creak of a door, every flicker of a light, brings me back to that night, to that terror. I know he's out there, and the dread that he might return haunts me still, threading through my dreams like the fog that envelopes our quiet, lonely store.